All right, super. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us for our webinar, Leading in Business as Unusual. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be exploring ways to think about leading change in what we think is our new context of business as unusual. Just to recap, we can't see or hear you, but we can see the chat. So do comment, reflect, ask questions in that. We're really happy to be interrupted. There is also some dedicated time at the end for Q&A as well. We've also got some questions throughout for you just to do a bit of reflection. Don't worry, you don't have to, you're not going to be called to come off mute, but it might be helpful to have a pen and paper ready just so you can jot down some thoughts and your mobile phone for a couple of Mentimeters as well. Right, let's say who on earth you're hearing from today. My name's Lucy. I've supported leaders and teams throughout transformation programs for over a decade. I'm a qualified coach and I head up the leadership development and coaching offering at Gate One.
Thank you, Lucy. Good morning. I'm Stasha and I've been supporting people through transformation since the early noughties, including the setup of the Olympic Delivery Authority in 2009 for the 2012 London Olympics. I also spent 10 years as a leader in industry, and so I have experienced transformations firsthand. I'm a ProSci certified change practitioner and passioneer at Gate One.
Great words, Stasha. Very quickly, as we've mentioned, we work for Gate One, which is part of the Havas Group. For those who aren't familiar with us, we are a change and transformation consultancy, and we support clients on some really complex challenges, from strategy to digital transformation and kind of reimagining their operating model. But within our people change practice, we focus on change management, culture change, and leadership development. And it's within that remit that we join you today. So let's get on with today. What we wanted to do first was just kind of think about what actually is it to be a leader today, because we think things are changing for leadership. Partly driven by the pandemic, digital ways of working have accelerated. And linked to that, we're now managing hybrid working. There's loads of anxiety about, be it health or job security. And actually, in a recent McKinsey report, 59% of employees reported having at least one mental health challenge. It's a huge amount. We ran a LinkedIn poll just before Christmas, and one of the top things keeping leaders awake at night is budget or resource constraints, which is of course linked to the wider economic uncertainty that we're feeling. I don't know who's listened to the news this morning, but my advice on that would be don't listen. And finally, this is anecdotal rather than grounded in any data we've collected, but there's a power distance that we're observing between leadership and employees, and that's changed because as leaders, you're on remote calls with your contemporaries, you're not necessarily passing members of staff in the office. And actually, this was back in 2018, but the stat you can see on the screen is from a Harvard Business Review that found that 58% of people trust strangers more than their own bosses. So the main thing to take away from this opening slide is that leadership has changed, management has changed. And honestly, there's probably about 10 different themes that we wanted to expand on, but we've really tried to reduce just to a few relevant things that we think are important for 2023 for the rest of this webinar.
Thanks, Lucy. So we're going to start with how we perceive our business as unusual world using this acronym, BANI. I don't know if any of you have come across it yet. So BANI suggests that we perceive the world today as brittle, anxious, non-linear, and a word I can never say, incomprehensible. Yay! Which probably means that none of us feel like we're getting it all right. So we're going to just explore these four areas for a minute. So brittle, that's where neither we nor our world are strong. Anxious, so where we feel like we control very little. Non-linear, there's no simple or straight route from A to B. And finally, incomprehensible, where we have all the data and still no clue. rather than saying something about the world, it says something about how we perceive it. So interestingly, it's not the world that's become banny, it's actually us that finally let go of the illusion that it is not. A little history. So the creator of this acronym is somebody called Jaime Cascio, who's an American anthropologist, futurist, and author. So our webinar is all about leading change in this new business as unusual world. Interestingly, I'm going to invite you to reflect on the next slide on the stat and the statement. So 82% say market disruptions have become more frequent and impactful than ever. And indeed, 85% of those senior leaders have also been involved in 2 or more major transformations in the last 5 years, which is huge. And worryingly, 2/3 of those surveyed also said that they'd experienced at least one underperforming transformation during that time. We are definitely in an era of business as unusual, and gone are the days of Lewin's freeze, change, unfreeze model, followed by steady state working for a year or 2 or 3, which is why we all feel the way we do, right? So over to you, Lucy, to ask our attendees for their thoughts. You might want to grab your phones and go to menti.com.
Brill, thanks, Dasha. Yeah, we wanted to start with this because, you know, we can do our research, we can give our perspective on what we think it's like to be a leader, but actually we know that there's a huge diverse set of leadership on this webinar. And we want to hear from you. This is anonymous and there's no wrong answer. It's just us being curious. So if you could grab your phone, open the camera app and scan the QR code, or if it's easier, there's a link that's gone into the chat to a mentee. And we're just curious, a couple of words or a couple of phrases. What is it like for you or your leader at the moment? What are your biggest worries and concerns? What keeps you awake at night? I'll just pause on there to let everyone kind of get hold of that QR code, and then we'll move on and see what people are saying. Okay, I'm going to move us on, but the link in the chat is still valid and the codes are still at the top. So I'm going to look to my left where my screen is. Doing too much, budget constrained, it's constant, too many priorities. Yeah, these are things that certainly my current client's saying. What else have we got? Generation gaps. That's interesting because we touch on that later. There's multiple generations in one organization now, and they each have quite a different take on either how to do things or how to be treated. Stressful. Interesting. So there's uncertainty. Where words are bigger, they tend to be being typed in more by all of you. So the fact that chaotic is in the middle there, that might be resonating with more than one of you.
That tells us all we need to know, Lucy, doesn't it? It does.
Yeah, completely. Oh, well, listen, we're going to leave that open and we'll share the final word cloud afterwards, but that is really interesting to see. And
some fab stuff coming up in here. I'm just looking at it on my phone separately. Yeah, no, really interesting. That's we'll definitely come back to that. Thank you, guys.
So what are we going to do about it, Sasha?
So as we've heard and as we can see and as we've probably felt, the pace of change is speeding up and it will not reach terminal velocity. It is going to get faster, I'm sorry to say, and faster. And we won't keep getting faster with it. So we do need to look at what we can do differently. So as leaders of change, in this webinar today, we are encouraging you to change how you think about change. So with that in mind, it's time for the big reveal. Let's look at the 4 areas that we're going to focus on in this webinar. Okay, here we are. Thanks, Lucy. So as the pace of change increases and businesses are in this realm of continuous evolution, and breathe, there are 4 key principles that we want to focus on today that will help HR and change centres and also business leaders to think differently this year, 2023 already, when leading change in business as unusual. So they are as follows, and as you can see in front of you, perfect decisions don't exist. They really don't. think like a scientist, to TikTok or not to TikTok, which is all about communication styles and your authentic self, and no need to be a superhero. So we're now going to have a look at each of these principles in more detail. There we go. So we have our first principle. What does decision making look like today? So softer is the easy answer, but also retaining accountability as a leader. It's not a total free-for-all. In a recent project, Gate One were helping our client with a discovery phase, so to replace aged finance systems. And there were a number of ways that we helped our client to navigate imperfect decision making.
Sasha, I'm so sorry to interrupt your flow, because this is a great example. I know what's coming. I just wanted to, I think you've just missed out a little bit to explain this slide, which is perfect decisions don't exist.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Have I jumped by accident? Yes, I have. Thank you so much.
That's
Okay,
right.
so before I go into my example, I'll give you a bit more background. Okay, the good news is the pressure is off. We can't do it and you can't do it. So let it go. Leadership paradigms in the past. So we often focused on decisiveness and making big, bold decisions. But actually today, it's about working with teams to find the best next action instead. Again, that's quite hard to say. And today's leaders don't make all the decisions. That's really important. So I'm going to say it again. Today's leaders don't make all the decisions. So we're having to learn how to make decisions together with what we know and can absorb now. And as leaders, we also need to take BANI into account and accept that those perfect decisions don't exist, and that better decisions are made through collaborating with others, and that we don't need to have all the answers. So leadership in the BANI world is more about setting clear strategic direction. So let's now go back to that example, and I'll talk about how we've actually been helping one of our clients to do this in practice. So coming back to replacing the aged finance systems in the discovery phase. So we were co-designing the virtual whiteboards with subject matter experts, so SMEs, to bring the right information into the session, but also to equip them to be able to collaborate in the decision-making process during the sessions themselves. We ran short preparation warm-up sessions with workshop series attendees before we actually started the workshops, so that they could get comfortable with virtual whiteboards. Some of them had never come across them before, and actually it helped to massively reduce any anxiety that they may have had around the whiteboards, or actually the whole thing itself. Inviting other projects to present their own scope and plans as part of our workshops was really important, and that was part of engaging key stakeholders early. So getting early sight of sense of direction and giving everybody the ability to influence the decisions being made. It was a nice inclusive touch, and it also avoided those barriers and challenges that can crop up later, and helped us all get aligned. And actually, brain science tells us that most decisions are actually emotional rather than rational. Again, I'm going to pause and just let that sink in. Most decisions are actually emotional rather than rational. And as a leader, we can help to reduce the complexity of decision making by creating guardrails. And what that looks like is things like decision making frameworks, or just criteria, or design principles, for example, that really help groups to make better decisions more easily, and they're also strategically aligned. So in this context, we defined criteria. So we looked at business value versus complexity to implement. And so we mapped on a 2x2 on a chart to understand and help us prioritize and identify quick wins. So those are some examples of what you can do. Now, through co-design, warming people up, early engagement and use of things like guardrails, we were able to help the client get those clear outcomes and best next action. So that's a big thing to do, letting go of the need for those perfect decisions. So before we move on, I'm going to ask you to exhale. Let out your breath, drop those shoulders. Go on, do it.
Mine dropped out 4 inches.
Mine is still dropping. And I wonder how often we stop to do that, because actually pacing ourselves and our energy is going to be really essential this year. So now let's look at a summary of what this section means in practice. Right, so there are ways to embrace imperfect decision making. And here are some of the key practical tips that I've talked to already, but just to reinforce. So for HR and central change teams or project teams, do engage people early to both give them early sight and give them the option to influence decisions. Collaborate with others to find the next best action, and don't expect to have all the answers yourself. Take that pressure off, let it go. And as business leaders, apply those guardrails. It'll make you feel better, but also it'll help the decisions stay strategically aligned, as well as being transparent and reassuring. And it might just make it less complex. Co-design rather than making all those decisions yourself. You don't need to have all the answers. And yes, I'm repeating myself, but I'm doing it on purpose, so it's all good. Okay. I want you to take a moment yourselves, given what you've just heard, to reflect on this principle. What's going to help you change the way you make decisions? Now, you don't need to answer me or pop anything in the chat, but perhaps make a couple of notes for yourself. Do it now. I'll now hand you over to Lucy to explore how to think like a scientist, our second principle, to help us lead through business as unusual. Over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Sasha. All right, think like a scientist. I reckon that currently we are encouraged to get into arguments and prove that our point is right. So think about how we're invited to interact on social media, or how we expect politicians to stick to their answers as the right way. This thinking is about being comfortable with adapting as you learn or as things change. You know, complex problems call on us to stay mentally flexible, after all, and changing your mind doesn't make you a flip-flopper. It means that you're open to learning. And we know that evidence shows that in learning cultures, organizations innovate more and make fewer mistakes. But it is good to do this learning and this changing our mind in a structured way. So we've created a word cloud, one of our favorite tools of this webinar. We've created a word cloud of buzzwords that we think this principle consists of. Thinking like a scientist requires testing something, learning from it, and then pivoting according to your results. And it's related to agility. And it plays into our Banny element, incomprehensible. We need to gather data to make sense of the world around us. And to do this, you need a more experimental way of working. What do we do when we conduct experiments? We hypothesize, we test that hypothesis, and then we see if it achieves what we need. So a hypothesis to change behavior might be, if we run a drop-in clinic, we will see an increase in the number of users of a system. Or if we improve stakeholder trust in data, they'll use a new dashboard and not manually check numbers in spreadsheets. So hopefully you can see how these can be tested with change interventions, and if successful, scaled, or you pause or you pivot, depending on what your findings show you. Just to give you a real life example, we worked with a client a couple of years ago that needed to roll out Microsoft Teams. Who didn't at the start of COVID? They needed to roll it out to 18,000 people worldwide, so different languages, different geographies. And what our team did was designed their approach with a small selection of people who would be impacted, who are expected to adopt Teams. And they came up with some hypotheses. If we catch people in the lunch queue to demo Teams, the uptake in that office will increase. If we put guidance on Teams rather than on SharePoint, adoption will increase as traffic is driven to the application itself. And if we invite people who use Teams from early on to be change champions, they'll encourage others to use it. And they tested these hypotheses on a small scale, first of all, gathered feedback, refined, and then picked the most successful ones and rolled out to the wider organisation. And within 10 weeks of launching the programme, over 70% of the organisation had adopted the tool, which was a fantastic rate. And Stasha, this is less about experiments, but does play on the agility nature of Think Like a Scientist. I think you have an example about a Marco, was it?
I do. So yeah, it's a bit of a tragic example, but it is an experiment in a way. So Marco, a leader in his organisation, decided that he was going to turn all of his leadership team into agile specialists, and insisted, as part of a wider transformation that was going on, that we ran some agile bootcamp training with his leadership team. And despite guidance, because we didn't really think he was ready, he insisted. So we did an initial day of agile bootcamp training with his leadership team, and halfway through the day, when the trainer said those very special words, that agile is all about asking for forgiveness, not for permission, his face dropped, and every single person in that room clocked it and switched off, because they understood that there was no psychological safety, and that Marco wasn't really signed up to letting go of control in the way that he needed to in order for this to really take off in his organisation. So a brutal experiment. It certainly wasn't what we set it up to be, but it's a really good example of where those things can come to light. And we had to pivot, and it all worked out in the end. But yeah.
Oh no, thank you for sharing. Right, let's wrap Think Like a Scientist up. What does it mean in practice? As you've gathered, we're splitting our tips into people that might be driving actual transformation programs, if you're in HR or if you're in a change centre, versus a business leader leading business as usual, to coin the phrase. Right, if you are in HR or a change centre, then you really want to focus on getting your business comfortable with experiments. So maybe start with a couple of relatively inconsequential ones, just to see how they land and demonstrate their value. And also be savvy about the data that you collect. What data can you get, and how much is enough to move forward? This is more than just volume of data. Are you collecting information that really helps you understand what people are experiencing, and therefore what's going to help their behaviour change? As a business leader, you might not be running the experiments yourselves, but you can set the right culture by adopting a growth mindset. This is one of my favourite things. So simply asking, what have you learned if something goes a bit wrong or awry? Remember that disruption or obstacles are really normal and really to be expected. And if we're thinking like a scientist sees negative results as an opportunity to disprove a hypothesis. So as long as we remember that we can all handle unknown consequences, especially if we lean into them and frame them as frame challenges as opportunities. And the second piece of advice about what this means in practice is be curious. So don't make assumptions or force your point of view. Remember, this is a new paradigm of leadership. This is about being curious, learning, and providing a steer where needed. So I shall also invite you to pause to see what this principle means for you. I just want you to think to yourself, how do you react when people disagree with your opinion? And while people are reflecting, I'm just going to check the chat, but Stasha, we haven't had any questions, so we can crack on, which is great. We're doing really well for time. Have a little think. If there are things that you want us to clarify or go over again, folks, drop it in the chat. Or indeed questions, and we'll pick them up. Otherwise, Stasha, please chat to us about our third principle.
Thank you. So welcome to principle number 3, to TikTok or not to TikTok. I wonder what Shakespeare would have thought of that. This is about finding your own style, your own communication style that represents an authentic version of yourself. So nowadays, leaders do need to use a range of both physical and digital channels and mediums to engage their teams. Lucy, you talked about hybrid working earlier, and obviously that's had an impact. To add to the challenge, today's workforce is, of course, made up of 5 different generations. That always makes me smile. 5 different generations, as well as having to think about, quite rightly, neurodiversity. And as a leader, you'll need to try and speak to and resonate with everyone. Research has also shown that the Gen Z attention span is only 8 seconds. I paused for 3 seconds there. It probably felt like the longest time in the world for some of those Gen Z guys. So a lengthy email update is unlikely to hit the mark with that group. The question then comes, how best to engage in a way that appeals to multiple generations, cuts through the general noise, and represents an authentic version of yourself? So Lucy and I have some examples to share with you. Lucy, can I invite you to share the first example with us, please?
Yes, you're right. I did request to interrupt you at this point. So I've worked with this chap who's the CFO, Chief Financial Officer. So he runs the finance function. And I thought it was worth starting with this because he does not enter into TikTok, commenting on company intranet, doing talking head videos, that kind of thing. But he is very good at just standing up and talking to his function. He doesn't use slides. He makes sure he's well read on the topic that he's talking about before. And he is just so authentically himself that it's still incredibly compelling and very engaging to listen to. He does it frequently, so it's not that he's absent. And I think that's just a really good example of, you don't need to be on TikTok to be a present, engaging leader that talks authoritatively to your function or to your team.
That's a great example, thank you. So the second example we're going to talk to is about one of my clients who was uncomfortable with those kind of large formal broadcast comms. And she was much more engaging, actually, in smaller, shorter group sessions. And she totally accepted the need for her to repeat the same thing with 5 different groups. What she found for herself was that she could share information in that format and also encourage questions and discussion in those smaller sessions, which worked better for her and her audience during a particularly complex set of transformations. And then the third example, so I'll talk about the cube in a second. In the early stage of a project, we needed to raise awareness of the project itself globally. So we challenged each of the regional change ambassador communities to generate ideas of what would work for them. And there are 3 ideas I'm going to share with you. So in Turin, in Italy, they chose to compete, handing out project bracelets. So we gave them 100 each. And during their coffee machine chats with different people, every time that they'd positioned their elevator pitch, they would hand out one of these bracelets. And so the first of the ambassadors to hand out 100 bracelets won. And we had a top 3, and it was all very competitive and frantic. Chicago literally hated that idea. So they ran coffee mornings with short quizzes and shared loads of photos of the events on MS Teams and generated a bit of a buzz. And then in London, they designed a self-assembly desk cube and massive posters, and all were super successful in raising awareness in their own context. So those are 3 examples. What do we mean by digital platforms? Here are a few of our favourites that you may want to consider.
Yeah, that's great. Just before I move the slide on, Sasha, I feel like the London office had it right, but maybe I think that just because I'm work in London. We've had a comment that's actually completely valid about the attention span of Gen Z, and it's
we've lost you already. Then is that it?
Well, no, I think it's a good point. They're just saying that it's not that different to other generations, and they've read that even Buddhist monks say that after 7 seconds they lose their concentration and their mind zips off. So we mustn't be too stereotypical, but it's still an interesting observation. And the fact that it came up in the word cloud earlier, there's still a generational difference in terms of maybe how people are working and attitudes and expected to be in the office. Anyway, interesting comment. Love it.
Absolutely.
Right, I'll move you back, Sasha.
No, it's all good. It's all good. Okay, so digital platforms. There's a plethora of platforms and channels out there to make use of when creating engaging content and communicating change. And we've put some of our favourites on screen in front of you. Have a think about how you can optimise the content for each platform. Obviously, don't try and use them all, but acknowledge the diversity of your people and maximise their engagement, and find out what works for you, and don't be afraid to experiment. So coming back to what Lucy was talking about, you probably won't get it right first time, and that's okay. I'm not going to go through each of them. We are using Mentimeter today, of course, but there is a list of what each one is and what it's used for that we can share. So if you're interested in us sharing that list, tell us in the chat and we'll share it afterwards. So that's the list of digital change tools. Right, let's look at some practical tips on how to do communication well, which, you know, I'm sure you've seen some before, but this is our refreshed version. Okay, so there are some practical tips around how to maximize engagement, which is always super useful. So if you're a HR and change team, there are 3 things that you can focus on. One is novelty. So coming back to behavioral science, it tells us that humans love novelty, which probably isn't news to anyone here. It drives engagement, adoption, and it really does make an impact. It's not easy, but it is an important one. The second one is variety. So try and use a range and do that experimentation. Diversity. So considering those generational and neurodiversity differences across your workforce, and cater your messages as much as you can. And then secondly, if you're a business leader, similar stuff, but tailor your engagement methods. So maybe ask your audience how they want to be engaged. I know, revolutionary. My colleagues have shared a really nice anecdote actually with me about one of their clients. And after months of being encouraged, and I put this in brackets, badgered, sorry, Lucy, she realised that we have to communicate until you're bored. So communicate, communicate, communicate. Because change can be an uncertain time for people, and providing that level of reassurance and calm through a regular rhythm of communication is super effective. And finally, coming back to that, to TikTok or not to TikTok, show your authentic self. So find the styles and methods that best suit you and your people. And the key is to be flexible, but also find what works.
Absolutely.
So once again, I'm going to ask you to take a moment to reflect on the principle we've just covered and think about, if it's not TikTok for you, what could it be? Give you a moment. I'm now going to hand you over to Lucy, and we're going to go through our 4th and final principle. No need to be a superhero. Hey! Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Stasha. This is my favourite, I think. And it's the final one.
Are you allowed to have a favourite, Lucy?
Yeah, absolutely. Stasha, we're the presenters, so we get to pick what we want. No, I think this is an interesting concept, because I think this is another great example of that shift in leadership paradigms and how it's changing. So as a leader, be it of a specific delivery project or in general business, you are probably looked to, or you may feel like you are looked to, as the fountain of all knowledge with all the answers. But in a world of business as unusual, you can't know everything and you can't have all the answers. And leadership now is less about swooping in and saving the day, and more about visibly empathizing, reassuring, and empowering others. And it links back to what I said at the very start about that distance between leadership and staff. It's about being a human being and connecting with people, not playing the superhero. I think there's a really good example here in Jacinda Ardern. So think how popular she has been and the global response to her resignation. And as we were compiling this bit of research, she actually came to office the same year as Donald Trump. I think that's just very interesting, 2 very different leadership styles there, reflecting what I would describe as the old and new paradigm of leadership. Now, I'm not putting this up to invite political debate, and I'm certainly not commenting, on which leadership style was better. But she does have this fantastic quote, which is, you can carve your own path and be your own kind of leader. And we do need to create a new generation of leadership that meets the current needs in our business as unusual. What does this mean in practice? So Warren Buffett, the American business magnate, said that the difference between successful people and really successful people is that really successful people say no to almost everything. So limit your work in progress. Everything takes longer than you think, and switching between tasks is quite expensive cognitively. We get tired and the brain can't cope. Sasha?
I don't know if you remember, but when we did our webinar last January, we talked about burnout. And one of the key things that stuck with me when we were preparing that was, actually, when you're looking at burnout, one of the key things is, how often do we do less? How often do we cross things off the to-do list and de-scope things? How often do we say to people, actually, just prioritize these 3 things and don't do the other things? So stopping doing stuff was a real kind of eye-opener for me when we were doing the preparation, and that's just popped into my mind now, and it hasn't in any of our prep sessions. So
that's interesting. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think the example we used was New Year's resolutions, wasn't it? How many people have made resolutions, and how many people have made a resolution to stop doing something rather than take up something new? So interestingly, that's completely ad-lib, but it does link really nicely onto my other example, which is on the right-hand side of the screen. Warren has this prioritization tip, which I actually read in Oliver Burkeman's book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, which is worth a read. He invites you to make a list of 25 things that you want to do, either in your career or your life. And there's a kind of arbitrary list there, just so you can see how many 25 things are. Now, do the top 5. And he says, never think about the other 20 again. They will distract you and take time away from the top 5. I find this very difficult. I find it a very challenging concept, and I think it would be even more challenging to do in real life. But as well as prioritization, it links back to our principle, there is no need to be a superhero and do all 25. Do your top 5 things well. What else does this mean in practice? I've just had a question. What was the name of the book Lucy mentioned? Yeah, we will also send that out in our recap, but it's called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. And it's by a fantastic chap, Oliver Burkeman, who for many years was amongst other things, a journalist who wrote a column in The Guardian called This Column Will Change Your Life. And he's basically explored throughout these years all the different time management tips and applied them to real life. So he's well worth looking at, but I'll post it in the chat when I finish my spiel on this bit.
Thanks, Lucy. Great question.
Right, what does this mean in practice? Okay, if you are leading a change, if you work in a change centre, if you're in HR, there's something about language which is quite powerful. And I think I'd challenge you, how are you supporting your communications team or your leadership team to say we instead of I, to bring teams along? So we need to, or how we will do this. i.e., you're conveying that it's not one superhero doing this, it's a collective effort. And then my second tip is, how can you create a culture where it's okay to say no to a new task, or maybe say, yes, I can do that, but what needs to drop? And it may be, in particular, if you're working in a change centre, that you need to have an open conversation with your leader to make sure the most important things are being worked on. For business leaders, this is my challenge to you. Free yourself up to lead. Don't take it all on. You might feel a bit brittle or anxious, to go back to our Banny view of the world, in doing this, because it requires letting go of control. And let's just acknowledge that that's an uncomfortable feeling, letting stuff go, or the perception maybe that you're letting it slip. But freeing yourself up to lead, and you've got this team of people around you doing the delivery, let them be the experts. And the final tip, which is our final tip of the whole webinar, which we have also emphasised in previous January webinars, is prioritizing your well-being. We've said it before, you cannot pour from an empty cup. To lead others effectively, your energy must be replenished too. This isn't a wellbeing webinar, so we haven't got lots of practical ideas of what that means, but I did just want to share my current client works tremendously hard. They are very, very able and very hardworking. But honestly, I think they must have negotiated into their contract more holidays than most, because they are always taking long weekends. And I think that's how they keep going and work so hard for the whole year and deliver so much. It's because they are little and often taking a lot of time to replenish their energy with these long weekends. Anyway.
Nice. I like that idea.
So and another great tip in the chat, stop doing things creates headspace, which ultimately saves energy. And it's kind of quite difficult to buy into that until you practice doing it, and then you realize the benefits. So thank you for that comment. Right, final pause before we come on to a wrap up and some Q&A. When do you play the superhero? Why do you think you're doing that? Brill. Well, look, we've been going for almost 45 minutes, so let us move us on to, if you take nothing else away, we have thrown quite a lot of anecdotal experiences and tips and probably too much jargon at you. So we wanted to whittle it down to 4 things. If you do nothing else, what could you just start doing this afternoon? Remember that perfect decisions don't exist. Get comfortable with the next best step that you can take for a particular decision that you're struggling with. Think like a scientist. Take one idea that someone's had and just test it, and then scale or pivot. To TikTok or not to TikTok, why don't you just ask your team how they like to absorb information this afternoon? And finally, no need to be a superhero. What 3 things do you enjoy most about your job? And I dare you to delegate one of them now. Because if you love it, you're probably spending too much time on it and you're not freeing yourself up to lead in other areas. Handful of behaviours you can put into practice immediately. And let me leave you with a pondering quote, a quote to ponder. When people are depending on us, we end up finding strength we didn't know we had. This is a great quote by Adam Grant, who's an organisational psychologist. He really knows his stuff. Just wanted to reassure you, really, leading is hard. And just by signing up to this webinar and sticking it out to the end means you're thinking about how to do it. And it has always been difficult. It will continue to be tricky, but you are doing a good job by considering this stuff. So we've been really chuffed that you've been able to join us. Final thing, we'd love to know kind of what's excited you most, or maybe what stands out the most from the last 45 minutes. So if I could once again invite you to grab your phone and scan the QR code. There's another link that's going to go in the chat if that's easier. And anything, again, this is anonymous, there's no right answers, but what might you mull on a bit more? What might you go put into practice? I'll just leave that up to let people.
It's also not a test, is it, Lucy?
No, it's certainly not. No, it's certainly not. All right, I'm going to move on to see what answers we're getting, but the link is in the chat. Oh no, delegate my favourite thing, sad face. Well, I'm very impressed that you've owned that. Support leaders not to be a hero. Yeah, it's a kind of learning curve. It's the mindset shift. Pick my next best action, take a holiday, get rid of priorities, 6 to 25. Oh, there's loads of things. Look up some tips on how to cascade. Fantastic. Good work.
Oh, we've got the Banny model in there as well.
I love it. All right, team, there's loads of other resources that Gate One has. I'm definitely not going to read through this slide. I just wanted to bring it to your attention. We have webinars, we have other articles, we have other web pages, but most importantly, Stasha and I love talking about this stuff. So we will share all this with you, but do reach out if you want to chat about how to do this or about a challenge that you're having in your organisation. We marketed this as a 45-minute webinar. We have achieved that just maybe plus 2 minutes. Stash and I will stay online for Q&A. But if you need to drop, thank you so much for joining. We hope you found it a useful session. Have a really good rest of the day. And for those who can, by all means, stay on and we'll answer any questions that you've got. You're not going to magically come off mute. So if you've got them, then chuck them in the chat. Lots of thank yous coming down. Brilliant. There was one thing, Stasha, I don't want to put you on the spot, but we did have a question earlier that I jotted down in the chat. Yeah. You mentioned, this is going back to not making perfect decisions, and it can be helpful to have some guardrails and a decision-making framework. Do you have a bit of a recap on how you've helped businesses make a decision or maybe prioritise which activities to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways of doing it, and it really depends on the context, of course. So it's that consulting answer, it depends. But some examples, and I think I talked to this earlier, the one that we've been doing at the moment, we looked at the value to the business, so literally low, medium, high, and then along the bottom, complexity to implement. So get this the right way around. So low value, high complexity, medium complexity, low complexity. So we could identify which things were really high value and really easy to implement, because they're your quick wins, right? They're the things that you want to prioritize. And then conversely, the things that were really low value and actually an absolute nightmare to implement, and in 3 years you probably weren't going to see any value. So those are the things that you put on the back burner. And then you get all the stuff in the middle, and that's where you have the discussion around, okay, well, and you can apply, tools like Moscow to prioritize. So Moscow is a really acronym because it's the worst acronym in the world, right?
Yeah.
I know you know it, Lucy, but for the benefit of one or two that might not know it on the call, Moscow stands for must do, should do, could do, won't do. Worst acronym in the world, but it kind of works. So you can then look at the things that are in that kind of middle layer and really make, have some conversation, discussion, get the best information from different people around the things that are kind of medium value and medium complexity, and think about which way do you want to go with those things and start prioritizing them. So that's one really simple example, and it's really that's one that I think is probably quite tangible and easy for people to apply in many different contexts. So that's the one that I'll talk to.
That's one really good. Brilliant. Yeah, I've used the complexity matrix as well. So thank you. That's actually all I've written down from questions that came through. So I'm so sorry if I've missed one whilst talking, but otherwise just lots of thanks.
Oh, bless you. You're all super kind.
Yeah. If there's no other questions, then we will try and stick true to form and not take you right up to the hour. So I guess, Stasha, let's stay on in case a last minute brave hand goes up. But otherwise, everyone, have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much for joining. We will share the link. We will share a bit of information that we've shared off throughout this. Get in contact if you want to talk more.
And guys, stay fabulous. Have a wonderful day. And I hope you enjoy putting some of these things into practice. All the best.